try to bring these webinars to life, to find interesting authors and look at the history of the Capitol and the Congress, and so that we might tell it as our mission requires us to tell it in a manner that inspires informed patriotism. We welcome each and every one of you today to the United States Capitol Historical Society's ongoing public history series. This is part of our work to try to create some understanding of the people who work in the Capitol building, and so that we might understand what is sometimes untold history. If you look at the news every day, you may mainly hear about conflict, but we often find ourselves, when we look at history, we find some accomplishment that is done in a very steady manner. So we hope that you will enjoy this lecture, and you will continue to share the work of the Capitol Historical Society with yourself, with your friends, with your family. It will be recorded, so it will be available for you to share. And we remind you, as we always do, that the Capitol Historical Society is chartered by Congress, but not funded by Congress. It's funded by the members and supporters of the society, people who believe in civic education, who believe in public history, and for that we are grateful. Today, we are joined by Christine Wolfe, the co-author of a new biography called Politics, Partnerships, and Power: The Lives of Raph E. and Marguerite Stitt Church. This book tells about the political life of the Honorable Marguerite Stitt Church, one of the founders of the United States Capitol Historical Society, and one of the first 50 women ever elected to the Congress. This is the very first biography of this 20th century powerhouse couple, who with visionary and persistent methodologies and hearts gave 4 decades of legislative service and established much of Illinois' dedicated political tradition, spanning everything from the awkward dance of prohibition in Evanston to Marguerite Stitt Church's involvement in the creation of the Peace Corps, with a particular focus on her remarkable legacy as a pioneer for women in government. This historical nonfiction is both a resource and a gripping delight, very fun to read. Christine Wolfe, who will be making our presentation, is an award-winning essayist and former weekly columnist for the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, and Patch. She earned her Bachelor's of Science degree from the College of Media at the University of Illinois in Urbana, and a Master of Arts in Teaching from National Louis University. Her first book, co-written with Jay Pridmore, is this political biography about 2 former members of the United States Congress. We are fortunate to have Christine Wolfe here with us today to tell us this fascinating story. Christine, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you. What an honor it is to be here. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. I'll share my screen and hope it comes through. Okay, are you able to see that? I'm assuming yes.
Yes, ma'am. Sorry, I turned my audio off.
Oh, not at all.
I wouldn't make noise so to interrupt your speaking. Yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you very, very much. And I'm delighted to tell you all about this remarkable woman, the Honorable Representative Marguerite Stitt Church, one of the founding members of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. What a delight. So this is the first biography about the political couple from my hometown of Evanston, Illinois, and they just left a lasting impact on American politics. In researching and writing this book, my co-author, Jay Pridmore, and I focused primarily on, we divided up the work. Jay focused on Ralph, and I had the good fortune to immerse myself in Marguerite Church's life. And I must confess that when I started the project in 2017, I'd never heard of the churches. By the time the book came out in 2023, I wanted everyone to know who they were, particularly Marguerite. And today I hope to show you why. And although Marguerite always intended to work behind the scenes, supporting her husband's political aspirations, her life shifted drastically after Ralph died suddenly in Washington, D.C., while serving his 7th term in the House of Representatives. So there's Marguerite next to Representative Fred Schwengel on July 31st, 1962, posing for a photograph after signing the founding document for what would become the United States Capitol Historical Society. And at that time, Marguerite was finishing her 6th and final term in the House of Representatives. She was 69 years old and preparing for her post-congressional life. Representative Schwengel was a fellow Midwestern Republican colleague in the House who recruited Marguerite and many others to help establish this organization meant to educate and captivate people about the importance of our capital and its history. And I won't take the time to read the whole mission statement. You can do a deeper dive during the video recording that you'll receive after this. But the last line, I think, really is one of the most important, and that is to foster and increase an informed patriotism of the land in the study of this living memorial to the founders of this nation and the continuing thread of principles as exemplified by their successors. Now, during the first gathering of what would become the USCHS, Representative Schwengel opened the meeting by reading from a prepared statement on the importance of the Capitol and its history. And in concluding the statement, he touched upon the need for a historical society. He said, "It seems to me that the millions of people, adult and youth, who come here need somehow to be helped while they are here to catch something of the fire that burned in the hearts of those who walked and talked in these halls. It seems to me that we must try to do a better job of educating our people on these things." And Representative Marguerite Stitt Church of Illinois then moved that an organization either chartered as a nonprofit group under the laws of the District of Columbia or chartered by an act of Congress be established, quote, "for the purpose of presenting information about the Capitol and the work done therein." So the resolution was unanimously approved, as was a motion by Dr. Richard Howland of the Smithsonian Institution to name the organization the United States Capitol Historical Society. And then Marguerite, excuse me, went on to serve as the Society's vice president. And the first organizational meeting of the Society was July 31st, 1962. And as you can see in the next slide, Marguerite's signature is right below Fred Schwengel's. And the statement of purpose was, as you can read later, to encourage understanding, undertake research, and to foster and increase an informed patriotism. But before she was co-founder of the organization and before she was one of the first 50 women elected to Congress, who was Marguerite Stitt Church? My co-author, Jay Pridmore, and I spent 7 years learning about the churches and speaking to people throughout the country, including Farrar Elliott, chief of the Clerk's Office of Art and Archives at the U.S. House of Representatives, as well as Dr. Matthew Wisniewski, historian of the House. And before I give you some behind-the-scenes information about Marguerite, here's her general story. Born Adelaide Marguerite Stitt, she was born September 13th, 1892. She was an American psychologist and politician who represented Illinois' 13th congressional district from 1951 to 1963. She was a member of the Republican Party. She attended St. Agatha School in New York City before earning an A.B. in psychology with a minor in economics and sociology from Wellesley College in 1914. And then after graduation, she taught a biblical history course at Wellesley College for a year before enrolling in a master's program in economics at Columbia University, where she graduated in 1917 with a master's degree. She then worked for a year as a consulting psychologist with the State Charities Aid Association in New York City. And then in 1918, she traveled to Chicago and met Illinois State Legislator Ralph Church, who she'd married that December. After marriage, she worked in a succession of organizations devoted to family and children's welfare. But following her husband's sudden death in March of 1950, Republican leaders in Illinois persuaded Marguerite to run for her husband's vacant seat. Winning nearly 3/4 of the vote in November 1950, she went on to serve 5 additional terms, winning between 66 and 72% of the vote in each of her 5 reelection bids. Her chief interests and influence flowed from her work on the Foreign Affairs Committee, where she was assigned to the Subcommittee on Foreign Economic Policy. She voted in favor of the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960, as well as the 24th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which prohibited the federal and state governments from imposing poll taxes before a citizen could participate in a federal election. In her final term in Congress, she championed the passage of the Peace Corps Bill, which we'll explore a little bit. And in 1962, as an advocate of mandatory retirement for members of Congress and facing reapportionment in her district, Marguerite set her own example by retiring at age 70 after the close of the 87th Congress. She worked on behalf of the Republican presidential campaigns of Barry Goldwater in 64 and Richard Nixon in 68. And she later served on the boards of directors for the Girl Scouts of America and this society. And she resided in Evanston, Illinois, where she died in 1990 at the age of 97. So that's the quick bit about Marguerite, but she was also an activist, a social reformer, a politician, a wife, and mother who lived during times of great change in the 20th century. In her 6 terms in the House following her husband's sudden death, she really surprised everyone because she had never intended to hold political office. So here's a very quick visual timeline. Born in 1892, graduated college in 1914, master's degree in 1917, married in 1918, and then for 32 years, she really stayed out of the public eye, doing a lot of behind-the-scenes work, a significant amount with Wellesley College as the head of its alumni association and so many other things. And she was also the president of the Congressional Club at the time of her husband's death in 1950. So when she stepped into Congress in 1951 and then served 6 terms, she did not want to be called a congresswoman. She insisted on being called a congressman. However, she did not run or refer to herself as Mrs. Ralph Church. She always referred to herself as Marguerite Stitt Church. She never wanted to tarnish the legacy that her husband had left, and she knew that she had her own views on things. And then for the 27 years after she left Congress, she stayed extraordinarily active, and we'll talk a little bit about some of that activity. So here's a newspaper announcement with her engagement in the Chicago Sunday Tribune in April of 1918. Marguerite is on the left. And here is the apartment that her parents owned on the Upper East Side of New York, where she and Ralph married in 1918. So in 1922, Mrs. Ralph Church, as she was known then, was living between 2 homes, one in Springfield, Illinois, where Ralph was often spending his time, and the other a small apartment further north in Evanston. She'd given up her career at this time as a psychologist and was happy to be her husband's full-time political helpmate. All the while, she was active in women's groups, most notably the alumni work for her alma mater at Wellesley College. And this is the Evanston home in which Ralph and Marguerite raised their family, ran both of their political campaigns, and frequently welcomed constituents on the front porch. Behind the scenes, Marguerite was quietly running her husband's political PR. And this is just one small example. And so many thanks go to the Evanston History Center for preserving what Marguerite had so meticulously collected through the years. And Marguerite really was the one who was designing all of his campaign material and many of his speeches as well. And by the 1930s, Marguerite began appearing in the news herself. In this piece, she's noted for organizing 600 Evanston women to canvass the district for contributions to charitable and welfare organizations. And here's a map of the brand new 13th Illinois Congressional District, which Ralph assumed in his 7th term in the U.S. House in 1931. This is Marguerite out for a stroll in 1932 with her 3 children. From left to right, they are Billy, Marjorie, and Ralph Jr. And then Marguerite in 1934 was the social chairman of the Women's Club of Evanston. This next photo, when I found this 1940 press photo in the Evanston History Center archives, I immediately knew that it would be the perfect cover for our book, depicting Marguerite as she conducted herself, hanging back, helping her husband with his briefcase, most likely filled with papers that she'd organized and even wrote. And here's how we converted the image to the book's cover. It's just quite an iconic image of the two, and a very rare image of the two of them, I've come to learn. And here is how artist John Jarvis even turned the iconic photo into one of his many political cartoons, which, again, Marguerite lovingly preserved and sent to the Evanston History Center for posterity, along with many, many other political cartoons about her husband. Here's one with Uncle Sam saying, "I wish I knew more men like Ralph Church. He's been in Congress for 6 years and he's never missed a session, a roll call, or a vote. He's what I call a dependable man." And to just note how dependable he was in Congress, he missed his son's wedding because he stayed for a final vote and entirely missed that. So this exemplifies his devotion to his service. And just, a snapshot that you can take a look at in the video later of some of these political cartoons that were just a delight to notice in the archives. So in this undated photo, Marguerite by then was splitting her time between her 2 homes, one in Evanston and the Shoreham Hotel in Washington, D.C. And here is Ralph at his desk in Evanston right around 1940. I do love this photo. This was taken actually a month before Ralph's sudden death. He and Marguerite attended a white tie dinner benefiting the Congressional Club, of which Marguerite was president. And in this photo, Ralph and First Lady Bess Truman laugh as Marguerite and Harry Truman, both of whom are presidents, she of the Congressional Club and he of the United States, are sharing their own laugh. And I keep the screen empty because in an instant, Ralph died on March 21st, 1950. He died in Washington, D.C. of a heart attack while testifying before the Executive Expenditure Committee. And while researching the book, I wanted to be in the room where Ralph passed away. Marguerite was back home in Evanston when this happened. So Jay and I traveled to Washington, D.C. many times, and we went into this room, which is on the 3rd floor of what was then called the New House Office Building, later renamed the Longworth House Office Building in 1962. And this is the view from that room. Ralph's death really led to political triage since the primary was less than a month away. And as such, they couldn't get Ralph's name off the ballot. So immediately, local political leaders looked to Marguerite, who was then 58 years old, to fill Ralph's vacant seat. And this, as many know, was how women typically entered politics then, through a process called widow's succession, whereby they fill the gap temporarily until another man was elected to fill the spot. However, Marguerite was anything but typical. She'd studied psychology, sociology, economics, and political science, and though she wasn't an attorney like her husband and many other legislators, since their wedding in 1918, Marguerite had been Ralph's political helpmate, finding supporters, writing speeches, documenting his journey, acting as a sounding board, traveling with him, all the while running their household and managing her own social and public service interests. So after Ralph's death, Marguerite ran a formal election campaign of her own and was officially elected to fill her late husband's seat, and then went on to re-election 5 more times. So as a quick visual, I think it's important to remember that in 1951, when Marguerite first went to Washington, she was one of 11 women in the 82nd Congress. And you can also take a deeper dive into these slides if you like with the video. So pardon me for just rushing through them a little bit, but I'll just do the highlights to say that by her 6th and final term, she was one of 20 women in Congress in 1961. And here's a little bit of a fun fact that many already know. There were no women's restrooms near the Senate chamber until 1992, when the media coined 1992 the year of the woman, after treatment of Anita Hill during the Senate confirmation hearings for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas in 1991. That situation, of course, signaled to women that they didn't have adequate representation in Congress. And so you can see the numbers just shot up. And then just for perspective, these first 6 bars are Marguerite's terms in Congress. Then the 7th one is 1992. And these last 2 are 2023 and 2024. So as of now, there are 152 women in Congress. And remember, Marguerite first entered as one of 11. So I've often wondered what Marguerite would think if she saw graphs like this today. Did she hope to see this? Did she expect to see this? What I would give to talk to her about this. And here's a final graph just to show the visual of how things have changed since she was in office. Okay, so during her first 4 years in Congress, Marguerite took an active interest in helping to implement recommendations of the Hoover Commission for Efficiency in Government, but she always made time for the needs of her district, including hosting constituents when they visited Washington. For instance, in 1952, during Marguerite's first term in Congress, she was the first person to take Black citizens into the House of Representatives dining room. And before it happened, she was told that she'd never get them through the door. In her 1978 oral history, she said she told the naysayers, well, these 2 boys are part of a group of 6 newsboys who worked for weeks selling newspapers, and I certainly do not intend to intend to tell them that they can't luncheon in the dining room of their own capital. So when I visited DC, I stood outside of that dining room and just sort of took in what it might have felt like to walk in those doors. And Marguerite said in her oral history that, quote, I walked with the 2 little Negro newsboys on either side. I entered pleasantly and greeted people as I walked down the aisle without resistance. Marguerite later said that she was glad she had the courage to do this, even though at the time she hadn't considered it courageous. At the time, she said, I had an inner insistence that it must be done. Now here's Marguerite with the women of the 85th Congress in 1957. And by then, there were 16 women in Congress, up 5 from when she first arrived in Washington in 1951. And here she is making more best dressed lists, which she absolutely despised being on. Marguerite's father had made a fortune as a glove manufacturer in New York, providing a very posh upbringing for Marguerite and her younger sister, Edna. So she was always a bit fashion forward. But though Marguerite frequently downplayed her grand background around her constituents, she leveraged her lifetime of overseas travel while serving on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I had so much fun exploring these signed maps that came back after her Foreign Affairs Committee travels, and she logged more than 100,000 miles as a member. These trips were just epic and just stunning in how much she and the members of the committee were able to see in such short periods of time. Marguerite was always the only woman on her Foreign Affairs Committee trips, and she had 3 rules for herself. Never make a complaint, never make a suggestion, and never come down to breakfast, because this, she felt, was the time for the men to have to themselves. She said in her 1978 oral history that she believed in, quote, reaching down and touching the millions of little people who, after all, inherit the earth, unquote. And she also said she loved learning what made people tick. On one trip to Africa in 1957, a report had come to Washington that the Soviet Union might be making great inroads among women. And in speaking to women in Africa then, Marguerite learned that they didn't want guns or money or atomic plants or navies. They were hungry to acquire skills, sometimes as basic as learning to hem clothes, just to help them make the next step up. So Marguerite worked very hard against many of the huge major appropriations for foreign aid. But as a result of exchanges like this with the women in Africa, she came out very strongly in favor of the Peace Corps, an organization close to President Kennedy's heart. Now, Marguerite never supported huge foreign aid bills, and she never believed that you could win friends or influence people merely by pouring millions or billions, by today's standards, into situations. And so Marguerite surprised everyone when she came out during her last term and supported spending at that time $40 million to permanently establish the Peace Corps, something dissenters called a, quote, utopian brainstorm and an unwelcome drain on taxpayers. Of the Peace Corps, Marguerite told members of Congress, quote, here is something which is aimed right, which is American, which is sacrificial, and which above all can somehow carry at the human level to the people of the world what they need to know, what it is to be free, what it is to have a next step and to be able to take it, what it is to have something to look forward to in an increase of human dignity and confidence, unquote. Representative Catherine May, a Republican from Washington, recalled that Marguerite's remarks on the House floor helped change minds across the aisle. Catherine May said, you could quite literally see people who had been uncertain about the Peace Corps bill, or perhaps who had already decided to vote against it, sit there, listen to Marguerite very quietly, and start to rethink. The House passed the Peace Corps bill after Marguerite spoke, 288 to 97. And Marguerite Stitt Church had become the unexpected champion of the Peace Corps. In 1961, President Kennedy appointed Marguerite as a United Nations delegate. And here's a little bit of fun detail about this photo, actually. Here she is on the left. And then here's President Kennedy, surrounded naturally by the ladies. And in the photo, the young woman standing to the left of Kennedy is Barbara Ludden, who was Marguerite's congressional secretary. While researching the book, I learned a funny story about this UN delegate swearing-in ceremony from Barbara Ludden's nephew, who told me that as the photographer was setting up a series of shots for this event, President Kennedy grabbed his aunt, Barbara Ludden, and said, stand by me. I want to be next to the prettiest girl in the room, which Marguerite just sort of scoffed when that happened. But that was passed down in the lore of Barbara Ludden's family. So here's Marguerite in her office in Evanston. She personally replied to 450 letters to her constituents each week. And upon her retirement in 1963, a young man named Donald Rumsfeld ran for and won her soon-to-be vacated seat. And while researching the book, I interviewed Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and his wife Joyce in 2021, the month before he died. The Rumsfelds told me that Marguerite was in a league of her own. After Rumsfeld won the election, 70-year-old Marguerite personally drove his wife Joyce from Chicago's North Shore to Washington, D.C., a 750-mile drive, to help Joyce go house hunting. And here's Marguerite, possibly at a retirement party thrown in her honor with Donald Rumsfeld, as well as Illinois Senator Everett Dirksen. And here's just a little bit more trivia, which I found fascinating. So upon Marguerite's retirement from the 13th Illinois Congressional District, which had nearly 1 million inhabitants, and was one of the largest in the country, it was chopped up into 3 smaller districts due to the results of the 1960 US Census. And the district had been served exclusively by Ralph and Marguerite before this reapportionment. So the new 13th district would now have just 500,000 inhabitants. And so it's a fact that it would take three men, Harold Collier, Robert McClory, and Donald Rumsfeld, to do the job of one woman, Marguerite Stitt Church. So when I stepped into the unknown to write this book, I discovered very quickly that Marguerite had also taken a huge leap of faith to go to Washington. And over time, she grew into her role. And as an author, I'd really done the same. This was my first book, and I had a lot to figure out. And I sometimes felt massive imposter syndrome. And I often wondered if Marguerite also felt that when she was in Washington, although I really came to understand that she probably did not, because she just had so much muscle memory and experience working side by side with her husband. I had this immense honor of investigating Marguerite's fascinating path and documenting it. And some of the things that just really stunned me, I'll share very briefly here. One of the things that occurred to me in writing the book was that many of Marguerite's darkest days happened in the month of March. For instance, March 17th, 1914, Marguerite was a senior at Wellesley College and president of the debate team when a fire broke out and destroyed her school. And this building here was literally the entire school. It housed the dormitories, the library, the classrooms, the dining room, the chapel, everything. And when the fire broke out and destroyed everything, headlines at the time suggested that the girls hysterically fled the burning building in their nightgowns and were saved by the heroic men. But in reality, the girls, who had insisted on an unconventional practice back then called a fire drill, exited the building calmly and saved themselves, as well as several members of the faculty. Surviving this tragedy would bond and galvanize the class of 1914 forever. Also in March, Marguerite's husband died suddenly. That was in 1950. Also in March, Marguerite literally dodged bullets and survived gunfire on the House floor during a mass assassination attempt on Congress in 1954. And I'm just going to very quickly read a passage from the book about that event. So the House had just adopted a rule for consideration of a bill governing the admission of Mexican farm laborers when the shooting began. The chaotic episode played out like a movie's action scene, as observed by one Chicago Tribune journalist who stood less than 50 feet from the assailants, one woman and three men, all from New York. Quote, the shots at first sounded like a string of firecrackers as they made a rapid cracking sound. The woman pulled out a Puerto Rican flag from under her coat and waved it. They shouted, Viva Mexico and Free Puerto Rico. 5 members of the House were injured, one critically. Representative Alvin M. Bentley, a 35-year-old Republican from Michigan, was bleeding profusely as colleagues rushed to his aid. Marguerite, standing on the floor, at first didn't know what to make of the scene. The reporter said, there she stood in the midst of it all. She wasn't hit, although a number of members were. Bullet holes can still be seen in the desk on the Republican side of the chamber. And then a few hours after the incident, Marguerite spoke to an Evanston Review reporter from her room at the Shoreham Hotel. In that call, she said, some goodwill likely will come from this fanatic but carefully plotted gun attack on congressmen in the Capitol if it makes the public realize that there is a spirit of evil abroad in the world and that it is a real and direct peril to this nation. The most terrifying part of it, Marguerite told the reporter, was that we were subjected to this continuous fire and were completely helpless, like standing ducks, and nothing seemingly was being done to stop our assailants. They emptied their Lugers into that group of 243 congressmen and weren't overpowered until they started to reload. According to Marguerite, who estimated 30 shots fired, the seats and the floor were a bloody mess where the congressmen were hit. The whole incident was insane and pointless, she said. We had nothing to do with settling the question of Puerto Rico's independence. And she referred to it as Puerto Rico, by the way, sick. Also in March, Marguerite's grandson, Todd, was killed by a CTA train a few blocks from Marguerite's home on the elevated tracks. Despite all these difficult times, though, that Marguerite endured, she kept going and she kept serving our country. And there have been many words to describe Marguerite Stitt Church, but based on everything that I've learned about her while writing this first biography, the best I can think of are distinguished influencer and judicious disruptor. She was also a woman of deep humility. In her oral history, Marguerite was asked why her political career had been so successful, and she replied, "I had an asset which was a great source of strength to me. I had never sought the office. I never expected to hold it." So Marguerite Stitt Church is buried next to her husband, Ralph, in Skokie, Illinois. Marguerite lived in a time when women ran for office before they were legally allowed to vote. She served in Congress during the second and third waves of women. And interestingly, she never called herself a congresswoman, always a congressman. She said, "I have never found that being a woman hampered my ability to be effective. I have sought to act as a congressman, not a woman." She ran her political career not as Mrs. Ralph Church, but as Marguerite Stitt Church, again, insisting that she had her own ideas and that she never wanted to tarnish the legacy that her beloved husband had left behind. She was quite an effective leader and a quiet leader who urged women to go into politics. She inspired their engagement, and she led by the governance in such a quiet way that she never told women what to do. She showed them how to do it by living a life of example through her legendary work ethic, her commitment to service, and a sense of duty to others over self. She had passion and aptitude for storytelling. She was a remarkable orator. She had a dedication to freedom for all people and a commitment to preserving history. Above all else, she would say that she had an unwavering faith and belief in God, in others, particularly in women, and in herself. Marguerite Stitt Church made politics appealing, accessible, exciting, interesting, and even noble. She made politics approachable by building a meaningful life of service to others. And that is all that I have for the presentation, but I am just delighted to take questions or talk a little bit more or tell you a little bit more about her. But I think I will stop sharing at the moment.
Well, we're delighted, Christine. You certainly have given us a avenue into the world of someone we didn't really know very well. And
I'm so
that's,
glad.
just imagine as we look today with 140 women in the Congress, and imagine what it was like when there were only 10. I can well imagine it, because in my own political life, I was in the Ohio legislature. When I got elected, I was one of 9 women but there were only 199, so 9 of 99. So she still had a higher ratio, a lower ratio than those days. So we got a couple questions from the audience. One person was just trying to track, Ralph was in the state Senate when he ran for the Congress. And when did he start? He served until 1950.
Sure. So he served in the Illinois House of Representatives from 1917 to 1932, 5 terms, 20 years. And then from 1935 to 1941, he was in the House of Representatives. He took 1 term off to run unsuccessfully for the Senate. And then from 43 to 49, he was back in the House. And then he died in 1950 in that 7th and final term in the House. Does that answer that question?
And then she served from 1950 until
51 was when she began, and she retired in January of 1963. So she served 6 terms total.
So as you look, do you think that you and your partner looked at Ralph and and Marguerite. Did Ralph have to change his opinion as he, saw Marguerite getting more and more involved in public life, or do you think he would ever have imagined her as the elected?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. No, sorry, let me clarify what I'm saying. Absolutely not too. Did he change? He didn't change really anything about his stance, although I do believe that she influenced his stance behind the scenes. But both of them were very clear about the fact that the intention was Ralph would have the political career and Marguerite would work behind the scenes. So it was just so stunning when he died. She had never considered running or stepping into public office. So, but he was never alive to see her
Or saw her
or do that.
Doing differently.
Mhm.
And is there any legislation other than the Peace Corps that she's really well known for?
Yes. During her first term, and I believe it's, I don't recall the specific bill that she presented, but she presented a bill trying to outlaw bootleg fireworks being transported into states where fireworks were prohibited. This came about because in her first term, there were two different incidents of children being either killed or maimed because they were, doing these mail order fireworks that were shipped to their homes that their parents either didn't know about or even condoned, but then, children were getting hurt. And so enough outcry happened where Marguerite put this bill together. It was passed into law. It took 4 years against so much lobbying, to try to kill it. And it still stands today. So I live in Illinois where fireworks are illegal. So, many people drive across the border over to Indiana and so forth just to buy them. It's really interesting to note that something that she felt so passionate about is still in place.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Now, are there issues where she and Ralph were on different sides?
There were, and I'd be happy to write them up and St. Lawrence Seaway. There were some
Just give us an example.
that's really one. They had such differing views, and I think I have something from the book, if I can pull it up really quickly, about what she said about that, and I thought it was fascinating. I hope it's indexed properly. St. Lawrence Seaway, 192. Thank you for asking that question. It's a great one.
Yeah.
So in 1954, she joined the majority to open the St. Lawrence Seaway in a multinational effort with Canada. A GOP House member rebuked her, saying that her husband would never have cast such a vote. She replied, "Neither would he have wanted me to vote for it if I didn't believe in it." Her critic was speechless. So she had the confidence to vote the way she felt was appropriate, even if it meant voting a different way than her husband, which I think was why she ran as Marguerite Stitt Church and not Mrs. Ralph Church. One of the examples of why it was important for her to be her own person.
Great story. So, you talked at the beginning about, her work with the Capitol Historical Society, and, we, of course, are very grateful to her work with Fred Schwengel. When you were going through her papers, did you find she was the vice chair of the board for many years and stayed involved, I think, even after she left the Congress? Was there anything that you could, pull out to say what she thought about the society itself?
Well, I still, frankly, have so much more research to do about her connection with Fred. That's something, in writing this book, it was such a juggle to try to figure out how much and to put into the book that covered two individuals, right? And I'll just mention there were two authors writing about two people, neither of whom were alive. And so we had such we had quite a few challenges trying to find all of the information and really talk to people who knew this couple. And what I would have given also to speak with Fred. But what is clear, and mark my words, I will be, looking into his papers as well, because I understand that there was a lot of correspondence between the two. Marguerite always had such a deep passion for history itself, but also documenting and preserving history. And what I would love to understand is, how did the two of them specifically meet? I mean, was it on the floor, debating something, supporting each other in something? They were both Midwestern Republicans. I mean, that much is true. But I don't know a whole lot about their dynamics with each other. I do know that he spoke so incredibly glowingly of her, especially after she died, after she retired. In fact, I think there's one thing that he said that is worth sharing.
Yeah, just so you know, we continue to stay in touch with his children and grandchildren, and have someone on the board who is from his family. So
Oh, wonderful.
if you ever need, chat with them, we'll
Yes,
be happy to
please.
connect you.
Oh, I would love that so much. Pardon me while I'm just looking up my page here. Here we go, 248. Okay. As Representative Fred Schwengel said following her retirement announcement, quote, "On the basis of education, of experience, of predilection for public service, and of performance, this representative from Illinois is what political scientists must regard as the ideal public servant." And added, quote, "The substantive story of this career is a story of enormous energy and activity, and all of it with results which mean much to the society of our time." And it should be noted, I suppose, that Marguerite even donated $3,000 of her own money, which in 2023, that would have amounted to about $30,000, just to help establish.
For which we are grateful.
Oh, yeah. Of course.
And so, this has been really delightful, Christine. We really appreciate you bringing to life one of our founders, and talking about, really a time when Congress was not very accessible to women. So one final question as we kind of move out, they started in Congress during what you would call the Roaring '20s, and you mentioned that they kind of did the dance around prohibition. Do you want to talk about a little bit about that moment in time when they started and how that influenced their engagement?
Both of them did not drink. They were, Marguerite in particular was a huge, the Methodist Church was her life. And Ralph had grown up in Catlin, Illinois, a tiny little farm town, had gone to the University of Michigan and then Northwestern University for law. And so much of what Ralph was trying to do was balance his personal interests with his constituents. And he ultimately did flip. But this is where I wish that I could have spoken to the two to ask, was it Marguerite's? How did they interact? I mean, here's the challenge that you find is there's so much that is lost to history about this couple, how they exactly met, what the conversations were that they had. Those weren't documented. And so trying to understand, we can go through all of the news, all of the clippings and so forth, and sort of see the trajectory. But what I wish to know, and I'm still hoping that will come to light, is how did Marguerite's influence on Ralph, her personal influence, really impact moments like that, where, you know, when he goes from one side to another, what did that look like?
Did you talk to her children?
No, we tried. We tried, and I will still try. I did speak to one of her grandsons. I also spoke to one of her granddaughters, and I had extensive conversations with one of her congressional aides, Una Corley Groves, who was from Evanston, and she and her husband were both congressional aides to Marguerite. And Una Corley Groves passed away a couple of years ago, and she was really, to me, my line into Marguerite's mindset. And those conversations humanized Marguerite for me in ways that no other research was able to do. So I was so grateful for her willingness to sit down with me multiple times and just tell me what it was really like to you know, for instance, after the shooting, you know, Marguerite took the tram underneath and got back to her office, and all the lines were jammed. And Una was telling me that, and it's in the book too, Marguerite was so unruffled. I mean, inside she was probably not unruffled, but on the outside she just stayed strong and steady. And to hear that from somebody who had been with her it just really helped me to feel who Marguerite was as a politician.
Fascinating. Okay, Christine, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who joined us for this moment. We appreciate, as always, your support, your engagement. Vincent, would you put up the screen of the upcoming events so that we might share what's coming up? We have a special webinar coming up on Tuesday, December 12th, after our Thanksgiving holiday, about the metal workers who built the Capitol. And this is something that Steve Livengood, who is our public historian, someone who, if you know the Capitol Historical Society, Steve's been with us one way or another for over 50 years. He knows more about the Capitol than anybody else. And he found yet another story about the metal workers when the Capitol was revised and the poles, you know, the pillars were redone with different metal. And so he's going to tell that story about from the perspective of the workers and the company where that was. So take a look and join us at that time. It's also, we remind you, it's holiday season. Now, what does that mean to the society? That this is your moment to purchase our Capitol Historical Society ornament. The ornaments we have are made from marble from the Capitol. When the steps were redone in the late 90s, the Capitol donated to the society the excess marble, you know, when they redid the steps, and we have that stored at a quarry, and we grind it up, and from that we create Christmas tree ornaments, cookie jars, and other commemorative items. And so when you're thinking about your holiday gifts, please think about looking at the Capitol Historical Society shop. It's all online. It's all on our website. And if you have any questions, let us know. And you can be both providing a very unique gift and also supporting public history. Thank you, Christine. Thank you to all of you. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Be well and have a good day. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.